During the passing of the peace, some of you may have noticed a tall stranger from the West. Pastor Craig, stand up and say hello. Welcome back after 7 years' absence. I think this may be the first time that all three of our children have been at First Presbyterian Church. There is Andrew and Nathan and Amanda and all of Amanda's family. And many of you always ask how Natalie is. Natalie is right there in the middle. Wave. No, she's 15. She doesn't want to wave. I think it was back in 1962 that President Kennedy went to Berlin and made the statement that we are all Berliners. Well, I think in light of what happened in Pittsburgh yesterday, we are all members of the Jewish community. We are all citizens of our friends across the lake at Temple Emmanuel, and many of them will be with us at the second service today. I liked the post that Nathan had this morning of the Pittsburgh Steelers emblem, and of course it's the symbol of the United States Steel, but at the top, instead of that symbol, it was a Star of David. It is, I think, very ironic that my last funeral here on Tuesday at 2 o'clock will be Juanita Black, because Juanita Black was the chairperson of the pastor nominating committee that brought me here. Thank you. I've just been overwhelmed the last few months with luncheons and dinners and cards and letters and gifts. You've all been so gracious, and today's celebration will be a lot of fun. So thank you so much for everything that you've done in saying farewell to us. Well, I've entitled the series of sermons that I've been preaching during September and October, Encore, because they're sermons that I have preached previously. Now, most of them have been sermons that I've preached within the first couple of years that I was here, but today's sermon I actually preached about 3 years ago. I also preached it at a convention in Houston, Texas, and I preached it at the farewell when I was stepping down as moderator of the Presbytery of Tampa Bay. A few years ago, I visited a seminar in Atlanta, and one of the guest speakers was Dr. Tom Toole, who had been the pastor of the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church of New York. He's an excellent preacher, and you may remember that Tom, about 8 or 10 years ago, spoke here at First Presbyterian. Well, at that conference, he addressed the topic of marching off the map, and I thought to myself, that will preach. I also had to chuckle because in the last few months I've been cleaning out my library, and I ran across an old book of sermons dating back to 1952, and the first sermon in that book was Marching Off the Map. So I took the idea for this sermon from Tom Toole. I'm not sure where he took it from, but as the writer of Ecclesiastes said, there is nothing new under the sun. This seems like an appropriate sermon for my final message here. Let us pray. Father, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. In Harold Lamb's book, The Life of Alexander the Great, he writes that somewhere around 330 BC, the armies of Alexander, which had marched across Asia Minor, through the Middle East, on through Persia, reached some mountains that were not on any maps that they had. And they realized that they had come to the edge of, for them, what was the known world. They talked a great deal about turning back because they had been years on the march from Greece. But Alexander stood up and said, mediocre armies stay within known territories, but great armies are willing to march off the map. And Alexander's army marched into the subcontinent of India and into history. It's a great story. Perhaps it's true, perhaps it's apocryphal, But we're always marching off the map, aren't we? A parent takes a 5-year-old for her first day of kindergarten, and you walk down the hall to the classroom, and then you release her hand, and she walks into the classroom and marches off the map. You graduate from high school, and the world is your oyster. Are you going to join the military? Which branch of the military? Are you going to go to college, university? Which university? Which college? Are you going to get a job? You march off the map. And if you've gone on to college and graduate school, when you graduate, it's time for a decision. Where can you get a job? And oftentimes that job is out of town, and you march off the map. Then comes marriage. You're in love. You think you know what you're getting into. You have no idea. You march off the map. And then there comes that birth of the first child. I remember driving home from Anna Jake's Hospital in Newburyport, Massachusetts, with Joyce and baby Andrew. Andrew's 46 now. And Joyce said, we need to stop at Shaw's grocery store. And I said, okay. Pulled up in the front of the store. And Joyce, now in those days, there weren't car seats. I know it was the dark ages. So I think Joyce was holding the baby. And she gave me Andrew and said, I'm going to run in the store. And I said, no, wait. I don't know anything about a baby. She smiled and left, and I marched off the map. You move to a new community, and it's like marching off the map. Now, I grew up, and Joyce grew up, in Lawrence County, Pennsylvania. It's a small county with about 100,000 people. And I went to college in the northern part of Lawrence County in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania. Then we went off to seminary, and when we came back, I took a church in Elwood City, Pennsylvania, in the most southern part of Lawrence County. And 4 years later, went back to my hometown and pastored a church there, Highland Church, for 10 years. And then in 1987, I accepted a call to Lincoln, Nebraska. And we moved our family 1,000 miles west. And I have to tell you that the first year I was there, I would come home from work in the evenings, maybe 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. And I would often sit on the deck. Now, we lived on the last street to the east in town. Behind us was a field, often in milo, sometimes corn. And I'd look out across, sit on the deck, and I'd look out across that field, and I'd think, what have I done? I had marched off the map. You lose your job. The kids grow up and move away. You lose your spouse. You experience a divorce. You march off the map. Retirement is like marching off the map. People say to me, well, what have you planned to do in retirement? Well, I have a few plans, but I don't know what it'll be like because I've never been retired before. Every church that I've left, the very next week, I've started at a new church. So this will be like marching off the map. And for you as well, it's been 20-some years since you've gone through a transition. And many of you don't know any other pastor, and you will be marching off the map. Today is Reformation Sunday. In 1517, Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the castle church door in Wittenberg and began the Protestant Reformation, and we marched off the map. Now, the classic Old Testament story of marching off the map is, of course, the story of Abraham and Sarah, which both Nathan and Paul shared with us from the Old Testament perspective and the New Testament perspective. Abraham and Sarah and their family were in Ur of the Chaldees near the Persian Gulf, and they traveled to Haran, and then God called them to go to a new land around the Fertile Crescent, a new land where they would become the parents of a new nation, the Jewish people. And they marched off the map into the Holy Land. The classic New Testament story, at least I think, for marching off the map is that of Jesus calling his disciples. He walks along the Sea of Galilee, and there's Andrew, there is James, John, and Peter, and he says, follow me. I will make you fishers of men. Now, they had a very lucrative fishing trade. But they dropped everything they had and followed Jesus and marched off the map. Marching off the map involves change. It involves an expedition beyond the familiar landmarks, a venture into uncharted territory. We feel secure within the boundaries we know, but sometimes it's necessary and important to blaze new trails and discover new worlds. Now, as most all of you know, I love history. And one of my favorite stories in the history of the United States is that of the Lewis and Clark expedition of 1803 to 1806. When my family and I moved to Nebraska in 1987, I developed a close friendship with Dr. Gary Moulton, who was a history professor at the University of Nebraska. And he was also the editor of the Lewis and Clark journals. Dr. Moulton introduced me to Stephen Ambrose, who was an acquaintance of his. Stephen Ambrose was a famous writer and had just written the #1 bestseller in the United States called Undaunted Courage. And he used Dr. Moulton's edition of the Lewis and Clark journals for the background for his book. And his book is a day-by-day, week-by-week, month-by-month account of the Lewis and Clark trip. The idea for this expedition came from President Thomas Jefferson. He had spearheaded the United States purchasing the Louisiana Purchase from France, which doubled the size of our nation. And then he asked his secretary, note, the President of the United States in 1803 had one secretary, Meriwether Lewis. And he asked his secretary, Meriwether Lewis, to put together what he called the Corps of Discovery to explore this new territory. And so Meriwether Lewis found a military man, William Clark, and together they got 30 other men, and then added to that a French trapper by the name of Charbonneau and his remarkable Native American wife, Sacagawea, and they made their way west. In 1804, they left and canoed and pole-boated up the Missouri River. They believed that they could find a water route to the west and would connect with the Columbia River Basin and then to the Pacific Ocean. That first winter, they stayed with the Mandan Indians in North Dakota. And they explained to them that there were tremendous mountains ahead. And I'm sure Lewis and Clark and the others thought mountains like the Appalachians in Virginia and North Carolina and Pennsylvania. They had no idea. When the Corps of Discovery reached the headwaters of the Missouri River, they did face enormous mountains, the Rocky Mountains, the Bitterroot Range. They thought they would crest that first mountain and look out upon the Columbia River Basin. But when they crested the mountain, they looked out upon 150 miles of tremendous mountains. So they did something radical. They stored their canoes, they hid them. And then they bought horses from the Shoshone Indians and went over the mountains. Now that in itself is a remarkable story, because the only reasons the Shoshone Indians sold those horses to Lewis and Clark and their men was because they recognized Sacagawea. As a little girl, she had been taken by the Mandan Indians in a raid. She was the sister of the chief of the Shoshones. Go figure, the providence of God. Recently, I read a book by Dr. Todd Bolsinger entitled Canoeing the Mountains. And he addresses the changes in society and in the church today. He uses the Lewis and Clark expedition as an example of adaptive change and writes, in every field, in every business, in every organization, leaders are rapidly coming to the awareness that the world in front of us is radically different from everything behind us. After centuries of stability and slow incremental change, in less than a generation, our world has become VUCA, V-U-C-A, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And how true that is. When I graduated from seminary in 1973, I knew how to do church because the church in the early 70s was very similar to how church was done in the 60s and the 50s and the 40s. You had the same worship styles on Sunday morning. Organizations like Sunday School, Women's Association, the men's groups, age-graded choirs, and youth groups were the key elements to build a strong congregation. 50 years ago, people embraced what was called Christendom. The Bible had been read in the schools. The Ten Commandments were generally viewed as moral standards. And many people, even if they didn't go to Sunday school, dropped their children off for Sunday school. And the church was filled every Sunday. Folks, unless you've missed it, that doesn't exist anymore, or rarely exists. We're living and ministering today in uncharted territory. Like Lewis and Clark, we cannot canoe the mountains. Churches and other organizations need to shift their focus and climb the mountains. We're in unfamiliar territory, as were Abraham and Sarah, and Peter and Andrew and James and John, the disciples of Jesus. A few years ago, Kim Spurlock visited me, and she explained that she and Craig had not been able to come to church because they had a beautiful child who had autism. And she asked if there was some way the church could do something to help them and other families. I didn't know what to do, so I went across the hall and got Kenny Ellis, who was then the director of education, of course now is our associate pastor, and he and Zach, soon to be the interim pastors of this church. And I said to Kenny, here's the situation, and he determined that he would study it with the Christian Education Council, and with the session's approval, they did. They moved ahead and hired Elise Ruster, and we launched the Mini Miracles program, which has now brought at least 20 families to this church. And then along came the amazing Evelyn McMullen, and we expanded our special needs ministry into a Saturday morning buddy break where families with special needs children can drop them off for a few hours, and they received wonderful love and support and care here. And then we've extended into Shine On, which is the Wednesday evening program for young adults with special needs. And if you come here on Wednesday nights, you'll see the choirs practicing, and 60 or 80 or 100 kids at the youth group, and 30 or 40 kids in kids club, and you'll find 20 special need young adults in Shine On. And then, of course, we've joined with the Tim Tebow Foundation in the wonderful prom that is held every year, and you should come along with about 500 or 700 other people to see the Florida Southern lacrosse team, so many helpers here, and Pastor Zach, who's a marvelous disc jockey, playing for that Night to Shine dance. Let me share another personal example of how we've marched off the map. Do you know how difficult it was for me 12 years ago to watch 150 people go with Pastor Craig over to the fellowship hall and start the Vine service? I had loved preaching to a full house at the 10:30 service. And I thought, well, we'll start that new service and 50 people will go. It was more like 150 that left. But over time, hundreds of new people have come into this church because of the Vine service. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "For everything we gain, we lose something." And I had to give up my ego needs of preaching to a packed house on Sunday in order for the church to grow in a new way. I'm a huge fan of the leadership guru, John Maxwell. He's worshiped with us a couple of times, and I can still look down here and see him sitting down front. He wrote, "One does not discover new lands without losing sight of the shore for a long time." Sometimes you have to sail off the map. It's hard to let go of the past and venture into the future with something new. On the Mount of Transfiguration, when Moses and Elijah met with Jesus, in that wonderful mystical experience, Peter spoke up and said, Lord, Lord, let me build 3 booths here. One for you, and one for Elijah, and one for Moses. Let's just stay on this mountaintop. But the ministry was down in the valley, and Jesus would move from there to the cross of Calvary. The Roman Catholic priest, Henri Nouwen, wrote that people get stuck because we're afraid. But remember the oft-repeated phrase in Scripture, fear not. Isaiah wrote, do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, I will help you, I will uphold you with my righteous hand. Remember what the angel said to the women on Easter morning. Do not be afraid. He is not here. He has risen. Alexander the Great's army came to those mountains, probably in Afghanistan, in about 330 BC. They talked about turning back, but Alexander said, mediocre armies stay within known territories, but great armies are willing to march off the map. And instead of turning back, they summoned their courage and marched off the map. We've come to the end of our journey together. It's time for Joyce and me to move on. It's time for you to move ahead with new leadership and march off the map. It's okay. God is with us all. Now, I thought that a good closing song would be a song that I often sing during football games in the fourth quarter. And I love to watch football games. And usually I get about halfway through the fourth quarter and I begin to sing a song made famous by Dandy Don Meredith, Turn Out the Lights, the Party's Over. But then I thought better of it and decided that we should sing one of my favorite songs from childhood, We've a Story to Tell to the Nations. Scott, fire up that big Austin organ and let's sing for the glory of God.